Hi, I'm Lauren, and today I'm going to be sharing with you 20 ways you can improve your knitting and become an overall better knitter. These are things that about 7 or 8 years ago when I started knitting, I would have loved to have had resources or a roadmap to find where to begin or how to improve. Although some of these tips are geared towards beginner knitters, there are also a lot of tips that I found years into my knitting, and as a self-taught knitter, I scoured and scoured for some of this information until I finally figured it out on my own. So I want to share that with you today so that you don't have to scour the internet or whatever resources you're looking at in order to find out how to improve your knitting. So let's begin. Tip number one is to learn how to better read your knitting so that when you have a mistake or when you are in the middle of a pattern, you can really easily figure out where you are in the pattern and what you have just accomplished in the pattern. So learning to read your knit and purl stitches might seem a little bit advanced to figure out if you are a beginner knitter, but to be honest, it is really the foundation of learning and understanding what it is you're doing with yarn and needles. So a knit stitch is always looking like a V shape, and then a purl stitch is an oblong U shape or a little bump. There's so much more you can understand when you can read your knitting. So as you knit a pattern, try to follow along. Okay, if you did a yarn over or a knit two together, what did that exactly look like in your pattern so that you can, begin to read knit and purl stitches, but also different things that you're doing as you knit. After doing a couple sweaters, I learned that this is what a raglan increase is, and so when you can read what your knitting is doing, it helps you understand for future patterns exactly what the pattern is asking you to do. You can visualize it better. Tip number two is to practice. I will share a lot of great tips in this video, but just know nothing can improve your knitting more than sitting and really practicing what it is you're wanting to learn. So just begin. That would be my biggest and most wished for tip that I could have given myself when I first started knitting. Just start somewhere and be consistent. And that is kind of true for everything. But I think that if you do that, even just give yourself a challenge. Maybe it's 1 month. For 1 month, pick up your knitting for like half an hour a day and try something that challenges you a little bit each day, something like that. Or maybe each week you really work on one skill. And then eventually you will really become a better knitter. That is truly going to help you so much. Tip number three is understanding how yarn is displayed. This is a ball of yarn, and you start knitting it by finding the end of the yarn ball, and you can use it straight from the yarn ball itself. You don't have to do anything to it. You just take off the label and you can start knitting from it. Now, this is a skein of yarn, and I wish that someone would have told me that with skeins of yarn, you cannot knit straight from this. And you need to wind it into what is called a cake of yarn. So this kind of more, you can tell it's different in shape. This is a cake of yarn. I wound this with a winder and Swift, but if you don't have those tools available to you, you can usually get things wound in a store. If you've bought the yarn from a local store, they'll wind it for you. However, if you maybe bought a skein somewhere or online and you want to wind it, just look up techniques online that you can do without those tools. There are a lot of ways you can spread the skein out, and you just want to make sure you're not tangling it up, or else you'll spend hours untangling it. Not that I know from experience. I do. And yeah, so and eventually, I mean, if you tangle it enough, you might have to buy a whole nother skein of yarn. So always make sure you wind this before using it. You cannot use this straight from the skein. Another thing to keep in mind with yarn is yarn weights. Each yarn type has a different weight to it. If you check the yarn label, it will also tell you what the yarn weight is on the label, as well as what needles it recommends you use the yarn with. So make sure you check the label. And I also wanted to mention yarn weight can be changed by holding two different types of yarn together. It's usually a merino and mohair held together, and that will also increase the weight of the yarn. Tip number 4 is to better understand your needles. So the needles and the yarn go hand in hand, and first of all, you want to know if with your pattern you are knitting flat, which are typical, when you first start knitting, you think that this is like the epitome of what there is for knitting. The standard knitting, these are huge, by the way. But this is what you use for flat knitting. You basically just cast on to one and you knit until the one side of the cast on goes to this side, back and forth, if that makes sense. And then with that, you really can only make pieces and you typically have to seam them together. So flat knitting can only really do so much. Maybe a cardigan you can do all on flat knitting, which without seaming, which is really nice. But generally, I tend to prefer circular knitting now that I understand it. Back when I first started, it was very confusing to me. Circular knitting on circular needles. These are circular needles, and you have a cord, and these are actually interchangeable circular needles, so you can take these off and change the size of needle, which is super helpful. And to be honest, if you are a beginner knitter and you're trying to decide, well, you need all of these different sizes of knitting needles, where do you start? How do you buy all of those? Those were things I thought, like, does everyone just spend all this money buying every single size needle they need? To be honest, you really don't need the standard looking knitting needles. I rarely ever use them because you can use this circular needle for just about anything. You can use it for flat knitting, you can use it for circular knitting, and you just have to make sure you have the right cords. And obviously you need the different size needles, but an interchangeable circular knitting set is really going to help you a lot and keep you from having to spend more than you really need to. It is an upfront cost, obviously, because you are buying like a large set of needles. However, if you're serious about keeping with your hobby of knitting, it is a very good investment for your hobby. So, for example, this is my set, and I got a case for it to keep them in. So these are all of my knitting needles, the interchangeable ones. And then I have different cords. I have multiple of these cords and even attachments, so I can make a really long cord. So you just want to know that you can do circular or flat knitting with these. So if I were to recommend anything, it would be to just get a circular interchangeable needle set. And the ones that I'm using right here, these ones are the copper, I think they're called like Cypra or Cobra or something like that. They're the Likey brand, and I've really, really enjoyed these. Some people like wooden needles, and they sell them in this brand too, but I'm really happy with these. There are other brands that a lot of people enjoy. Everyone knits differently, and they find different needles that work for them. This has been the brand that I've really liked. It was the first one I chose, and I've really, really enjoyed it more than even a lot of the, DPN needles that I've used, different wooden needles or metal needles. But yeah, so if you're looking for a circular knitting interchangeable needle set that you want to buy, I definitely recommend these. They do sometimes tarnish a little bit, but I think that that's just copper. And I've noticed that a lot of times they do, the tarnishing does go away. But yeah, just a recommendation. I do like those, and you might enjoy them as well. Now, I mentioned DPNs. These are needles that have two-sided needles, and you usually use them in sets of 4 or 5 at a time. And I will say there's no hacking it like with interchangeable needles. You just have to purchase each size. And I typically like wood DPN needles because they tend to hold on to your your stitches better. With DPNs, you are basically doing circular knitting. So you have it kind of like this, and you go from one needle to the next, and you just go around knitting all the stitches on each one. With that, it's so easy to lose a stitch. And so having something that's wooden, these are the Chiagu needles. I really like them because they are wooden, but they have a little bit of a slickness to them. So the problem with wood is that sometimes it will stick too much, so you don't feel like you can glide through your knitting as quickly. These definitely are holding on to my stitches well without them sliding off, while also giving me enough slickness to be able to just go about my knitting more quickly than maybe some other wooden needles would. Tip number 5, find a pattern that you feel will challenge you just slightly more than anything you've done before, or something just that will get you out of maybe just flat knitting, or something that might hold some increases and decreases. Just try to constantly use a pattern that stretches your capabilities in knitting incrementally. You want to just improve little by little if you can, so you don't overwhelm yourself, and it's still fun and still a great hobby and enjoyable as you go. But you do learn a little bit at a time, and slowly you really will see a great drastic improvement in your knitting. So starting with a scarf and really finding one that you can practice both knitting and purling. I mean, if you want to just start with knitting, you can do that, but learning to knit and purl and become quick at both can be really helpful and help you to feel more proficient in patterns that you pursue in the future. So once you've done a scarf, like I said, just keep trying to improve and go forward from that, and do a little bit harder projects. I will leave a link in the description for some of the starter projects that I feel like are great beginner projects and will over time help you slowly improve your knitting while not overwhelming you so much. Tip number 6 is be okay with not being perfect from the beginning. And, even if you're like a year into your knitting or however long you are into it, be okay with continually doing something that you improve at and get better at. A lot of times we just want the instant gratification of being so good at something and not feeling like we are bad at something. We hate being so new to something, but the thing is in order to become better, you have to start somewhere. And sometimes using Instagram or different platforms to get knitting content from, to like watch other knitters or to see other people doing this hobby, it can be really hard to be okay with being slow or being just average at something to start, because you see people who have these big followings who are incredible at knitting, but really they did start somewhere. And honestly, most of the videos are sped up, because you only have so much that you can fit into one reel or something like that. So yeah, a lot of knitters, they don't actually knit that fast as some of these sped up videos would show. So just know that knitting is a slow hobby. It's not something you have to be speedy at. You don't have to accomplish so much in so little time. You can just enjoy it. And sometimes I do really like to accomplish things. Obviously, finishing a project feels really good, but you also want to enjoy your project and go at a pace that helps you improve and doesn't burn you out of your hobby. So be okay with being okay, and also be okay with learning and improving over time. You don't have to be perfect overnight. Tip number 7 is the beginning of every project you start, at least in my opinion, always feels unimpressive. I will cast something on and it just feels like this tiny little project that looks like nothing, that I'm like, how is this going to turn out? This does not look good. It can look flimsy, or sometimes you can look like you have a gap depending on if you're doing DPNs, like starting around, keeping that gap between the two needles closed. But to be honest, if you're doing it right and you are just sticking with it and you just keep pressing forward, typically it does turn out. And it's one of those things where you just have to trust the process. So trust the process and be okay with your project starting out looking a little I don't know, like chintzy and small and not impressive, and it will, as you go and as you trust the process of the pattern someone wrote, it will start to become what it's made to be, what your pattern is telling you it will become. If you're doing the steps right, like just trust the process. As long as you're doing the technique correctly, it might look small and weird at first, but it will come together if you're doing it right. So just trust the process. Tip number 8 is to familiarize yourself with knitting terms and abbreviations. When I first started knitting, that was something that was very overwhelming to me. So if you just spend maybe even like a couple days or a week sitting down and understanding, okay, this abbreviation means this, or this term means that I do this, really just trying to understand what it is each term means, it'll really pay off in the long run for you to be able to feel quicker and more fluid with your knitting instead of starting a pattern and being like, oh, what does that mean? And stopping and looking it up and then starting again and then having to keep doing that because there's a lot of different abbreviations you haven't sat down and taken the time to learn. That is really helpful in flying through a project, is just being able to read the project, read the pattern, and to instantly know, okay, this pattern is telling me to do this, I do this, instead of this pattern is telling me to do what? I need to figure this out, I need to look this up. Now, I still look things up like frequently. So don't feel like you can't look things up. You definitely can and probably will for a long time. But the more you familiarize yourself with the basic abbreviations and terms, it will help you to understand overall what your pattern is asking of you. So that is something I wish I'd just taken the time and really studied. Pretend like you have a test over it or something and just try to become really, really knowledgeable on what those things mean. Tip number 9 is you can start becoming more proficient at knitting without having to do an adult size sweater. So if you want to start a garment, but you don't want to invest a lot of money in yarn, you don't want to invest a ton of time, it sounds overwhelming to do a full garment. You also may not understand gauge very well yet if you're newer to knitting. My advice would be to start with a kid size project and do that because it's smaller, it feels less intimidating. You can knit for a friend who has a kid on the way, or maybe you have a niece or a nephew, and knit a pattern in maybe a 6-month size or a 12-month size, knowing that the baby will just grow into it at some point. The mother can decide, or if you have children of your own, you can decide what, okay, the baby fits into it now. Whereas with an adult pattern, you really have to get the size right. You really have to purchase a lot of yarn and spend a lot of time on it. I wish I had started with, maybe not started, I did enjoy doing a sweater for myself, but I do think that a lot of my improvements in knitting happened when I had kids and I started knitting for them. I really would work up a lot of quick sweaters and learn cables and lace and color work and a lot of new techniques that I didn't know. And I was able to learn them a lot quicker because it was a smaller garment that I was making. And I can move from project to project a little quicker and pick up new skills along the way a little quicker. Tip number 10 is you can knit either English style or continental style. This was very confusing to me at first. I didn't understand there is a difference between knitting continental and knitting English style. So familiarize yourself with both types of knitting and decide which one feels more comfortable to you. And, once you get to things like color work, you can actually use both knitting continental and knitting English. So throwing or picking, you might have heard those terms as well. If you can become proficient at both even, it might not be that bad of an idea to try. Obviously, stick with one that feels the most comfortable, but don't be afraid to test and try different styles of knitting because you might even be able to use them in the future. I use continental and English style knitting when I do color work. And that's been super helpful for me, and it makes my experience with color work not only faster, but also more pleasant and just fluid. So I definitely recommend knowing that muscle memory and how you knit matters, and you can determine what feels most comfortable to you. Tip number 11 is Learn to understand what fabric you are creating. So different stitch patterns. If you are knitting flat and you knit one side and then purl the other, you're going to be creating a stockinette fabric. If you are knitting flat or in the round and you knit and then purl and then knit and then purl, that is going to be a 1x1 rib pattern or stitch pattern. And if you are knitting flat and you knit each side, you're going to be getting a garter stitch pattern. And basically just understanding, I know it can feel kind of confusing because circular knitting versus flat knitting, there are some discrepancies between the two on what a stitch pattern entails. So look into that and try to understand what your project is asking of you and why you need to do certain things in order to create a certain stitch pattern. Understanding stitch patterns will be really helpful for you to understand as you begin a new project what the pattern is asking you to create fabric-wise. So you will probably have a picture, but knowing that a combination of knits and purls is what makes your stitch pattern and fabric come together, and what it'll look like is really important to what you are doing and the stitch pattern you are using. Tip number 12 is understanding how to avoid holes in your knitting. A lot of common mistakes you can also think about when you're knitting is making sure you're not wrapping your yarn incorrectly or before you make a stitch, because you could unintentionally be doing a yarn over and creating holes in your knitting. So if you are, for my first project, I did a scarf and there were a couple holes throughout that were not like dropped stitches. They were definitely holes. And I wondered how did this hole happen? I didn't know how to read my knitting at the time. Tip number 1, learn to read your knitting. It truly can help you in a lot of other ways, but dropping a stitch versus doing a yarn over will create a hole, but one will unravel while one won't. The dropped stitch will likely unravel, whereas the yarn over will just be a hole in your project. So be mindful of not wrapping the yarn the wrong way or accidentally wrapping it before doing a stitch, because you could be making a hole in your knitting. Tip number 13 is to use a crochet hook to fix your dropped stitches. That will help with time and effort and headache. It's so much easier, and I wish I had known to do that from the beginning. Tip number 14 is twisted stitches. You want to make sure that the way you're wrapping your yarn for a knit and a purl stitch is the way that it's supposed to be wrapped. So before you start a project, if you're feeling unfamiliar with what a knit and a purl stitch is, don't be afraid to just refresh yourself. And with anything in knitting, always look it up first if you're really unsure. You don't want to get halfway through a project and realize, like I did with my second project I made a sweater and had probably a quarter of it was twisted stitches because I was wrapping my working yarn the wrong way for knitting and didn't realize it. But my stitches were a lot bumpier and a lot less pretty looking. And if you ever drop a stitch, you want to make sure that you're putting the stitch back onto the needle the correct way, because it is clear after you've been knitting for a while which way is not correct and which way is correct, but it shouldn't feel twisted. It should feel like you're putting it on and it's easy to knit into or purl into. And if it's going the wrong way, I'll show you what it looks like. So this is with a knit stitch, this is how it should sit on the needle. And when I've dropped a stitch and picked it back up, like if one fell off and I picked it right back up, you can accidentally put it on the wrong way. And this is what it looks like when it's on the wrong way, put back on the needle. So just make sure that the stitch is sitting on the needle correctly. Tip number 15 is to understand gauge and to learn why it is you do a gauge swatch. So gauge swatches, you typically will need a ruler after you've done the gauge swatch. I have this little tool, and it helps if you make a gauge swatch that is bigger than 4 inches by 4 inches, or approximately 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. And what that will help you do is count the stitches within and the rows within this box. and help you understand what your knitting is compared to what the pattern recommends. The pattern will typically tell you that your knitting should be this amount of stitches and this amount of rows within 4 inches by 4 inches. And so if you have more stitches, if you have more stitches going this way than the pattern recommends, that means you are a tighter knitter, which means you actually need to go up a needle size. I know it sounds like because there's more stitches, you would want to go down a needle size. That might be confusing. But if you have more stitches, it actually means you're fitting more stitches into that square, which means you're knitting too tight because they're too small. So you want to possibly go up a needle size in order to make the stitches a little bigger so that they spread out a little more and you come to the right gauge. And same with if you're getting too few stitches into the box after you've done after you've done a gauge swatch, you will then want to go down a needle size probably in order to make your knitting a little tighter, a little smaller, so that you're getting the right gauge. Everyone knits a little differently, so a gauge swatch is just for you to try to meet the pattern's recommendation for what that looks like for the tension, and to be able to get the right size that you're looking to get based on the measurements that the pattern gives you. You want to make sure you're knitting the right size, not too small, not too large. So just making sure that you, even if you have to swatch, even if you have to make a little square swatch a couple times, making sure that you take the time to do that, especially before an adult size garment. With kids knitting, I tend to just knit ahead of time for them and they grow into it, but you still want to be mindful. And if you're using a different yarn or different needles, and your knitting is always different than everyone else's no matter what because of your tension being different, but you're also using different needles usually than the person who wrote the pattern, but you might be using different yarn, you really do want to do a gauge swatch to make sure that you know how the fabric is coming out when you're knitting that yarn together for the first time, seeing if you like the way it looks. It's helpful for more than just getting size. It also gives you an idea of what your fabric's going to look like. Tip number 16 is understanding tension. So tension is how tight or loose you knit when you are doing either knit or purl stitches. And it's important to know that how you hold your needles and how you wrap your yarn and how tight or loose that is and how tense or relaxed that is will affect your overall project, your overall product. Your knit stitch can be tighter or looser than your purl stitch. Typically a purl stitch is looser, and just being mindful that knitting flat versus knitting in the round can also change your tension. So if you start out in the round and then you switch to flat knitting, that can change tension and be noticeable in your project. Tip number 17 is knowing what ease is and understanding how that plays a factor in your final project. Positive ease is how much excess fabric you have outside of the fit of your body. This sweater has a lot of positive ease because it's more oversized and has a lot of extra fabric, whereas something with no ease is going to be just fitted to your body, and something with negative ease is going to cling to your body. So a lot of times negative ease is used for socks because you want socks to be form-fitting to your foot. You want it to cling to your foot and not fall off. So making sure you understand how you like your fit of a garment, and maybe in the pattern it'll tell you how much ease your end product should have, and that will help you understand how big and oversized or how fitted or tight it will be to your body. Tip number 18 is if you are new to knitting or if you are a seasoned knitter, you should look for patterns at your local library in order to get free patterns. And this is also amazing if you're wanting to try, say you're proficient in making sweaters, but you really want to learn how to make socks. It might be helpful to have access to books that can teach you how to do socks and have patterns for you to try before you go and spend money on a pattern and then find out you don't really like knitting socks. So definitely check out your library. We are very blessed to have a great local library that has a Knitting for Olive book, a Petite Knitter Arctic Knits book. We have the 52 weeks of socks and stuff like that. So I find a lot at my library. I will say my library is also open to acquiring books that patrons recommend. So I suggest books to them all the time. And honestly, they've purchased a handful of the books I've recommended for the knitting section. So maybe try that. And you can always borrow books from a friend if you know a knitter. But for self-taught knitters, the library is a great ally in your knitting journey. You can also get yarn for a better price too. So if you are looking for a good price on yarn, obviously check sales on your favorite yarn brands. Sometimes companies will run sales. You can also check Facebook Market. I've bought yarn and sold yarn on Facebook Market before, and both times it's been a win-win for myself and for the person buying or for the person selling. So I actually bought this. I have 3 skeins of this yarn, and I bought it on Facebook Market, and it's a great quality yarn. So just know that you can be resourceful where you purchase your yarn from and looking for good deals all around so that you're not overspending in your hobby. And you can be creative with your tools. You don't have to buy a brand new, like, nifty gauge swatch measuring tool. You can just use a ruler. For your stitch markers, you can use paper clips. You can buy used knitting supplies sometimes, and you just never know. If you have your eye out for it, you might be able to find things that you would have bought brand new and you could buy used. So just keep your eye out and definitely think of resourceful ways that you can source your patterns, your yarn, and your tools. Number 19, I wanted to share my favorite knitwear designers and yarn for those who are trying to determine where to start with great knitting patterns. Some of my favorite knitwear designers are Petite Knit and Knitting for Olive, which is also a great resource for buying yarn. You can actually choose the pattern you want and then choose the size that you're wanting to knit, and they will let you know exactly how much of their yarn to order, which I feel like is a really great option for someone who feels confused as to where to start. It's like a one-stop shop to make sure you get exactly what you need for your project. Now, another thing that is helpful is you can buy kits. My first garment that I made was from a We Are Knitters kit. It can be a little more expensive, but you will know that everything you need comes in the kit ready to go. So if you're wanting to get started and you just want to feel like you have everything without having to really think about it, you just really want to get started, that might be your best bet. And they have a range of different, levels of skill. So you can choose which garment you want to make based on your skill level. Some other knitwear designers that I enjoy following or I really like the designs of are Kutova Kika. She's on Instagram and on YouTube. I really love her designs and I would like to try some of her patterns eventually. I haven't yet. Another one that I would recommend is checking out Etsy. The pricing is usually a really good price point. And based on the reviews, if I pick a pattern that has good reviews, I have not had a problem yet with buying my patterns from Etsy. And I've found some really good patterns for my daughters. So kids knits are easy to find on Etsy as well. And I really also like the Petite Knitter. If you are looking to do color work, I have yet to knit her patterns, but I have looked through her book and I really do love the stuff she creates. So if you're looking to do some color work, she really does have some cool sweaters for that. Some of my favorite yarns, like I mentioned, Knitting for Olive is a great yarn company. I also love this brand called Mirasol. I've used their yarn multiple times and I've had great experiences with it. I'll link it in the description below. They tend to just knit up well for me. Aside from Knitting for Olive and Mirasol yarns, I also love the company Sorella Yarns. She creates lots of cool collections that she comes out with based on popular trendy things. So she did a Gilmore Girls collection, and she does collections based on mood boards she creates. She's very creative and her colors are exceptionally beautiful. They're hand dyed and I love a lot of what she puts out. So you might check her out. She's on Instagram. That's where I found her. Aside from that, Sandness yarn is one that I haven't knit with yet, but I've ordered it and received the yarn. And I love the feel of it, and I'm really excited to try it. I've also heard great things, and I know many experienced knitters love Sandnes Garn yarn, so you might check them out. They are a little pricier, but they're a great quality yarn. Tip number 20 isn't much of a tip, but it is a resource that I find invaluable for improving your knitting. It is an article that tells you what skill level you are as a knitter approximately, and what skills you can achieve in order to keep leveling up your knitting. So I'm going to share it in the description below, and I hope that it helps you in having a roadmap to know where it is you can continue to move forward with improving your knitting. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm so excited for you to improve your knitting and to continue in on your knitting journey. I hope this video was helpful for you. If you liked it, make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more videos, make sure you subscribe. And thank you so much for supporting my channel. And I hope you have a blessed day.